Welcome to the Human Ideals Podcast,
where we use spirituality
to answer the world's most pressing problems. I'm Joshua Chang.
And I'm Austin Patrick.
So our first episode is about Ben Shapiro, who is visiting our university. Isn't that right?
Yep. Here at USC, we kind of view Ben Shapiro as, in terms of, we have two student bodies, obviously. The group that actually invited him was the Young Americans for Freedom, and they're more of a centrist, perhaps probably right-leaning group, depending on, by looking at their invitation of Ben Shapiro. And, as a comm major, going to the classes every day and whatnot, you can really see that USC is more of a left-leaning campus in general in terms of the rhetoric that is being discussed in classes.
Is it though? Because I often wonder, there are certain student organizations that say we don't want Ben Shapiro, but the USC, the provost, Michael Quick,
right,
sent out an email saying that we'll still have him through, saying that, it's not necessarily our choice to have him here or not, because I think their idea is that basically university is to quote Habermas, the public sphere.
Just like accommodating institution.
Exactly. So
yeah.
I think that's the general sentiment. I don't think the USC as an institution is against Ben Shapiro.
Right. I think that's also being debated, right? Because it's the question of who has more power between the student body and the actual administration, and that gets into, that's a whole nother conversation when you bring politics into it. It's like, what is the political leaning of us as the students, our own voices, and then the way in which the administration accommodates our requests.
So in short, Ben Shapiro, a famous conservative commentator, is coming to USC to talk. And some people clearly are not happy because he is known for his comments regarding the trans community, being misogynistic, and some people see that he is the worst of the bunch.
Well, at least according to their perspective, perhaps. And I think in some ways you can't really blame them for that.
No, but I think the question we have is, because we've seen these before, how we've seen the classic argument about how they say the university is this cuddled up liberal bastion that can't even stand an argument, and on the other side they're saying, well, no, it's the fact that we shouldn't allow these objectively toxic speakers to foster dangerous ideologies. And this is the debate that we have seen always. I mean, this is the only debate we ever see in terms of identity politics, about political issues.
Right. And I think it's also funny how, I think Ben Shapiro himself named it. I don't know if it was the YAF that actually named the event or Ben Shapiro himself, but it was actually titled Facts Don't Care About Feelings, this purposefully inflammatory title. I think it's really funny how that relates to this discussion of, are we inviting people who are overly ideological and, bashing certain minority groups, or is it the other way around in which we've sort of created this echo chamber where we can't really be accommodating to speakers like him? It's a very contested issue.
Right, and I think this is when we can probably bring in the idea of spirituality, because some might say that the stances that a lot of student organizations are taking is not a bad way of dealing with the inner spirit, whatever that means.
Right. In terms of accommodating all points of view, right? It's this, I think they're trying to be as ideologically open as possible, but I think the question is that how do you do that while still protecting people in terms of their, physical and emotional well-being, their safety?
Right. And, I think this, so we actually, obviously Austin and I have been talking about this quite a while because it's involving a university, and Austin raised a very interesting question, which is that if you see the both sides of the argument, they're constantly talking about each other, how the other side is the bad side, how we have the moral superiority over the other, and that's their justification. But Austin asked, well, why do people always look at the other side? Why do they not talk about themselves?
Right. And it's not even just like looking at the other side in terms of, oh, how can I see their perspective? How can I walk a mile in their shoes? It is, oh, how can I, disparage them? How can I make it so that my argument, stands superior to theirs? And how can I invalidate them in this sense, invalidate their sense of self, their sense of identity while promoting my own? I think that's, from both sides. It doesn't matter where you're more left-leaning, whether you're more left-leaning or right-leaning. I think that question is something that we don't want to address in a society that expects us to get along, that expects this sort of, cohesiveness, not ideologically speaking, but in terms of, not rocking the boat.
Right, and, I think there is a dichotomy, and I use the word dichotomy, because I feel like we're either given two options, how it's either a very antagonistic relationship, it's, you're right, I'm right, you're wrong, or it's either this kind of encompassing general idea of let's just love each other, why do we have conflicts?
Right, like...
And that's the only debate we almost see, and I think that those two are very two extremes, and I think that's why we don't really have a solution to these constant conflicts, is because we're either asked to embrace them, in a sense kind of dilute them together, even though they're clearly oil and water, or we are fighting against them.
It's almost like a form of conformism, I think. It's about, how do you be respectful without being conforming to each other's views, or just like even pandering, if that's the right word. Because it's like, there's two phrases that's used in terms of like freedom of speech and whatnot. It's like peaceful slavery or dangerous freedom. It's like, which one do you want? And even in that question itself, it implies that, okay, you can only have one and not the other, and each one comes with its trade-offs. So it's kind of like you're being forced into a no-win situation.
Right, and I mean, in a sense, these seems very, these are very dire and immediate social issues, but how does the tie, how does spirituality help, in a sense? How does our knowledge with spirituality give us a hint?
I think to address this, we have to look at in terms of the way our identity is formed. And, if you look in spiritual communities or any tradition, they all talk about the ego. And the ego, from psychologists such as Carl Jung and Freud, they talk of the ego as if it is something bad, like the id and the ego and the superego. You may have heard of these three terms, where there's always this psychological battle within our minds as to how do we do the right thing. And what that does is it creates an exclusionary model of the way we live in the world. We exclude some facets of our reality as not being us, not being, integral to the survival of our own identity, and then we include other aspects of our lives as being, oh, this is me, this is not me. And I think this is, we project this out into the world in saying that, okay, these are the ideologies that serve my well-being, serve my own, emotional inclinations, and these ideologies are for other people, or people who are lesser, or people who don't deserve to express their sense of truth and purpose, that don't deserve to, come up with their own solutions in trying to create peace in the world.
Right, and in the sense that, so what you're saying is basically we have a very good idea of who the self is and who the other is, in a sense that in order to get things done, you almost have to know who you are to tackle the other.
Right.
But clearly that has gotten nowhere, because in a sense it's then a constant battle of the others. It's the one singular being against the other singular being. Both have very good ideas who they are, so they claim, and they just clash against each other.
Right.
But I mean, hopefully, I think, is there a solution to just dissolve the others and to look at the self. I mean, granted, yes, I know this sounds all very new agey, saying that, you know, we are the world,
Right,
we're
yeah,
all loving
yeah,
together.
yeah.
That's not the point, though. That's not where we're trying to say.
Yeah, just to put this out there, disclaimer, this really isn't about, woo-woo or, shallow spirituality. Some people talk about, like, spiritual materialism just to serve, like, very shallow purposes. This is not about that. We're really trying to, even the word spirituality is highly loaded because we're really talking about, humanistic issues. So even from a secular perspective, this stuff still plays into, the way we view psychology, for example, which heavily deals with this.
Right, so, in a sense, I think I use the word spiritually very broadly, and I think it should be interpreted broadly.
Right.
I think the one example I have of this is how we actually use spirituality to solve real world problems like this. Is I think it was Rwanda. I think when the massacre that happened between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and their way of dealing with this wasn't to use very loaded ideological terms to brand each other,
right?
But to, I don't want to say revisionist, but what they did was they used the ancient tribal method of talking things out, which in a sense is not the kind of the spirituality in the sense that we're connecting with our older spirits, but in the sense that they had a very organic way of solving problems, which was they understood that they were a community. They sat down as a community, as components of the community, in the sense that they shared this kind of collective spirit,
right?
And they talked, understanding that at the end of the day they were a community. And in a sense, that is actually how they dealt with some of the post, genocide problems that they faced. That's how they reconciled. Whereas I think if we just use, a very, in a sense, very, colonial way of dealing with these problems, of saying, oh, this is an issue or a product of a socio-political conflict, of an ethnic conflict, I think that's when the problem occurs, is when we externalize these problems and to assume that to assume, and very, in a sense, very condescendingly, assume that these two things, which by the way, we have isolated for our sake, so we can externally analyze them, we think that these two things cannot work with each other, which, but they said, hold on. First of all, we are not the two things you claim we are. We are, in a sense, we define ourselves in our own way, which I think is spiritual, in a non-theistic way, and that's how they dealt with it. In a sense, I think that's the problem we have with Ben Shapiro and USC, is because both of the organizations see themselves as two very distinctive ideological organizations. One is kind of, we are liberals, we are people of progress, and the other side is, we are the other. We are Americans, who want to value the truth. We want people like this to talk more. And this is two constant struggles where I feel like, well, hold on. Why do you guys talk as if you guys will never see each other? Because in a sense, that's the problem that vexes me, is that we almost assume that the two will always shout at each other but never answer each other's questions.
Right. It's sort of like a two-way projection. Each side is projecting onto the other side their own fears and, especially the fear of their political values not being represented. And if you look at it that way, I think, especially going back to the Rwandan genocide example or even the colonial example, in that case, I think it's not even just a matter of identity anymore, because you can say that, the self, the sense of self is conflicting with the sense of self in other people, right? There is this dominance hierarchy at play where one side has to, overcome the other by necessity, or at least by what they think is necessity. But I think that if we look beyond the sense of identity, again, because tenet of spirituality is to transcend the self. And I think that can tie into the way we address issues of identity politics and intersectionality and whatnot, because we're focused on protecting the identity of certain minority groups with valid reason, with their safety and protection in mind, and to promote their sense of empowerment. But I think that at some point we are still dividing conceptually between self and other, so we cannot truly unify ourselves as a single cohesive unit that is actually trying to search for the truth together. So I think that we need to instead look within ourselves and talk amongst ourselves as to what are the actual underlying emotions that are actually driving this perpetual conflict, rather than just being, okay, we have our sense of self, everyone else has their sense of self, and trying to merge our sense of self. Even then, there is still, it's ironically, our languages, even our system of language is set up in a very dualistic way. Self, other. The moment you say self, you say, okay, there is an other. If you say that self and other are one, again, conceptually, your brain is very counterintuitive, because those concepts of self and other are still there. Even if you try to say that, okay, we are all one, or whatever, like the typical, new agey trope. And I think that that's a very surface level interpretation of what spirituality is really all about, because I think we have to ask, what are the underlying emotions that are the cause of human conflict? What do you think?
Right, I think that's the problem, is that we almost become too lazy with the idea of what spirituality means, is that we almost assume there is this kind of very theistic, kind of undercurrent that flows within all. No, the point
definitely.
of spirituality is to understand that, I think, how should I put this? Sure, there is something that can unite us together, but that doesn't define anything, in the sense that we have to define what that means through active discussion, action, and actually sitting down and realizing, trying to at least, to say, to understand the realities of things.
Right. Otherwise it becomes, armchair philosophy, and then people say, like, especially, just a side tangent, like in the current workforce, they say, like, oh, you're a sociology major, you're a philosophy major, what are you going to do? It's like, you just wasted your college tuition.
Right, and I suppose the question we should ask is, all this talk of, the active spirit, that's all very, fine and well, but they can ask, all right, but how do we apply that in a world and in debates like this, where things are already very ideological, where things have been very, very externalized and divided? How do we apply our theories when it's so divided already and so charged?
I think that goes down to, like I said, the emotions behind human conflict, rather than just looking at identity and trying to unify our, divided senses of identity within the community itself. We say, okay, for example, let's use Buddhism, because they work with emotions quite a bit. One of the tenets is, the three fetters, they call it, three defilements, the three flaws of ordinary people, so to say, people that aren't trained, is, they have greed, or what they call thirst, and anger, which is aversion. Anger, it's not, see, when you're doing a direct translation, it's really more about, it's very nuanced in the way that they use the terms. For example, thirst could mean, wanting something, or just even a very small desire for something, a small craving in the back of your mind that you can't really satisfy no matter what you do, the sense of restlessness. Aversion, for example, could be, let's say you have a bug bite, and then it kind of itches a little bit, and then you want to scratch it, but then, you're moving around, and for whatever reason you can't. So it's very granular in the way that they use these terms. And well, the last one is ignorance, or not knowing the truth. Again, that's a very loaded term, because in today's ideological climate, people are competing for the truth. We don't have a sort of a contemporary, like a centrist view to which we can just default to.
And we shouldn't. I don't think we ever should, because I think people, I kind of, in a sense, that's a problem we have, is that we assume that there is a truth that we can conquer. That, both sides think that, oh, there is this truth, and the problem is we haven't conquered it yet. If we ever become powerful enough, then we can disseminate the truth, the true truth. Which I think is I think that's the problem, clearly, is that, I mean, again, going back to the idea of the active spirit is to say, you know what? Fine, truth isn't there, in a sense, but we can construct it, and we can deconstruct it always. But in a sense, truth isn't something that we can truth shouldn't be something that we can lazily default into.
Right.
And that's fine. You know what? I don't mind conflict. That means I don't mind conflict. I don't think conflict's a problem, because conflict isn't a sign. Well, it's an idea of. Well, conflict is the evidence, I think, of actually being critical.
Right. Even that's a loaded term, because there are many degrees of conflict. Is it civil discussion, or is it like a full blown full-out war? Right.
Honestly, even if there is, I think where we can't kill. Even if it's a full out war, I think that's okay in that sense. But the thing is, what we're, in a sense, is what we are actually fighting for. In a sense, the problem with, wars most of the time is, do we actually ever fight because of the different opinions we have? In a sense, but then what they usually what do they usually divulge into? They usually divulge into socioeconomic conflicts, of abject racial hatred, or it's very illogical things, even though they have such logical justifications behind why they start these wars. Probably because they have created a very hard shell around the other. The other is not just an ideological term anymore. The other is a very tangible thing now, and in a sense, to combat the other, yeah, of course, you have to deal. That's why I think war happens. Is we have constructed and defined and alienated physically, just ideologically, physically, what the other is.
Right, and I think in that sense, if you look at the leaders of various countries and whatnot, the justifications that they provide for actually engaging in a war and trying to, elicit support from the public versus their actual underlying motives, that's a huge disparity, because they may say that, oh, we're fighting for the truth, we're fighting for the freedom of the people, or fighting for human rights violations in these countries, when in fact, for example, the U.S. and their relationship to oil, the oil industry, for example, they may not ever address that outright. They may provide other justifications, like what was it? I think they're war against Saddam Hussein, the Iraq war and whatnot. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but their justification, there is even from a not so informed public, there always is this sense of an underlying agenda, and I think that's why people are so skeptical nowadays. There's even conspiracy theorists that say, okay, 9/11 truthers, for example, they say that 9/11 was an inside job or whatever. That really is a testament to how we are living in a post-truth era, and we really have to redefine and deconstruct what truth really means.
No, because what the problem is, I think, is that we're living in an age where we assume there is an objective truth, but the realities of how the truth is being maintained is crumbling. It's that, for example, because I'm a journalism student, I'm going to say it in a journalistic light, we assume there is an objective truth to journalism, whereas the very economic structure, not just ideological, the economic structure of journalism is crumbling, essentially, and that's why people are losing moral authority. The journalism truth is crumbling because we can't sustain ourselves financially, economically anymore. And I think it's interesting that you bring up this idea of conspiracy theorists and, xenophobes or homophobes. I mean, these people, the funny thing is, that's why I think constructing the other is so harmful, is that they hate the other, even though they have never met the other.
Oh, yeah.
They assume the other exists because that's the narrative constructed. It's either me or the other. I don't know who you are, but I'm going to assume you guys are there. I'm going to enclose you in this boundary. And the dangerous thing is, even if it's purely ideological, I think that's sad, but what's really dangerous is that people have dangerously equated that boundary as a physical boundary, saying that, the other is there, we can attack them, we can kill them, we can destroy them. And we've seen that in Charlottesville, we have seen that in other kinds of riots, where there are violent physical clashes is because they each other create not only, you know, vague and abstract barriers of what the others are, but they've said, you know what, these are real. And not because, here's the thing, you know, I think the danger here is that the physical other they've constructed isn't based on anything but they're abstract. So in a sense, that's the dangerous thing. It's when their abstract theories of hate becomes physical reality.
They're kind of, they have a lackluster, you know, perception of the physical reality of the other, and then they create an abstraction from that, and then after that they project their abstraction onto the actual other, you know, when they meet face to face to have a sense of justification. That happened with colonialism, you know, that happened with Charlottesville and whatnot, to various degrees, obviously.
Of course, but I think that's the problem, is that it's quite sad, isn't it? Is that we assume the other exists, and we try to attack the other, even though the other isn't even the other you were looking for in the first place. It's like, kind of like, take Columbus, you know. I mean, that's perfect, actually. You know, think of Columbus. You know, he tried to conquer India, right? And then he went to America. He came to North America, and he saw these quote-unquote Indians because he thought they were Indian. And he massacred the Indians, even though they weren't Indians. They were Native Americans. And that's how sad is that, if you think about it?
I think it wouldn't even have mattered if he had actually set out to, you know, Native America in the first place and had like a rough idea of who
that's the
Native
saddest
Americans
part.
were. The attitude, the underlying emotions are the same. The underlying motives from which he set out to.
No, but that's really sad, though. Right, exactly. But that's the ironic part of it. Even though he did kill these almost people, his entire motive was inherently misguided.
Right.
His idea was that I'll find India. That was his boundary. That was his boundary that he created out of thin air.
Right, and use this journey for my own personal gain and
killed,
to acquire resources.
And eradicated real people. Even though historically they had no connections to India or whatever.
Right.
And that's I think a good example of how we create the other self even though it doesn't exist, and assume, and we kill off people even though they're not even connected.
Right.
But I mean, Columbus was probably convinced that he conquered India. I mean, I think he actually did. I think he was convinced that he conquered India.
And, you know, there's like a form of divine justification. It is God's will. We are created in His image, or only we are created in His image. These other people, they're not created, so we have to civilize them.
No, and you know, people sometimes say that, and I hear this a lot from, you know, people who, you know, like the Enlightenment, and that they think that, you know, we have grown out of the Dark Ages. No, but like, I think, sure, the medieval God, sure, that could be no longer there, but I think that God has been replaced by the God of Enlightenment. It's not about believing in God, it's believing that there's some sort of powerful entity or unifying thought that can, that's the thing. It allows us, it's a kind of thought, it's a kind of being that allows us to isolate the other. Because in a sense, sure, Enlightenment got us out of the medieval God, but then replaced that with, in a sense, kind of like this kind of scientism.
Right, it's a God of rationality.
Exactly.
Right.
You know, instead of the God that sends you to hell because you didn't, you know, fast the last Friday, now there's a God that will say that you should be exterminated, you should be isolated, you should be interned because of these quasi-scientific rationale.
Right. I think, you know, in both cases there is the idea of the transcendent ideal. You know, I mean, no pun intended, because human ideals and whatnot. But it's funny because I was writing this essay the other day. It's about ideology and hegemony, and speaking of that, in this dichotomy we have the self, right? And then to transcend our sense of boundaries between the self and other, to, you know, overcome this sense of antagonism and conflict and animosity, we have to create a sense of no self. And yet at the same time, I think that even though these transcendent ideals, whether it's God or scientism or rationality, even they were used for the purposes of serving the ego of these groups, especially, you know, colonialism and whatever group you want to call it, even in the Rwandan genocide, I think again, it's not about the specific identity of these groups, but rather how are they using the transcendent ideal. And to define it loosely, the transcendent ideal will be anything that defines our highest relationship, our most optimal relationship to existence as a whole, questions of life and death, questions of how we should conduct ourselves in society, how should we have a sense of life purpose. I think it's about using the transcendent ideal to build a sense of community, and at the same time not conforming to the ideologies of other people, to still have a climate of disagreement and civil discussion.
Oh yeah, and I think it's quite funny and it's quite ironic, I think, and to tie back to Ben Shapiro and USC, is that I don't think neither of these groups have looked at how easy the quote unquote the transcendental reality is, which is where are you? You guys are at USC. You guys are in a physically tangible environment, right? USC isn't the kind of vague community of. No, it's like literally USC is this square. I don't know, the hectare of
artificial. Yeah.
I mean, artificial, but might as well. Why not? Because let's not kid ourselves.
Meant to be.
Let's not kid ourselves. This is not about this. This is not some vague two entities fighting off against each other. You guys are both USC students. You guys are you guys have used USC funds to invite Ben Shapiro. You guys are uniting as USC students against a speaker invited by USC students. What's the underlying premise? USC. Let's deal with that. Though.
Right. It is a very specific context where people are privileged, and there is the whole stereotype of white.
Not that though. No. What I mean is
not in that sense.
We have a tangible environment, which is the USC, and let's talk about it within USC. That's my point. Because let's say that's the problem I always had with the the Habermas's public sphere, is that they assume the public sphere is something that's so wide and all-encompassing. No, let's not kid ourselves. It's a very specific sphere. It was back when Habermas defined the public sphere, it was a very specific sphere of educated white middle-class men who are literate. In this game, so is USC. And that, when I say that, I'm not saying to destroy the sphere. If it's there, let's use it. Because that's the only way we're going to solve this problem.
And not to undermine the identity of the people who are supposedly privileged, the white upper middle class. But it's not to undermine them as well, again, because we are trying to transcend identity, not to keep, perpetuating this divide between those who are privileged and those who are not, and sort of perpetuate the belief that, those who are not privileged have to rise up and, fight with the privilege.
No, I mean, you could, but, I mean, again,
not necessarily.
Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not ignore somehow that we're USC students.
Yeah.
We're in a privileged. All of us are privileged. To be honest,
if there's nothing wrong with that.
I mean, exactly. If we are privileged, we're all privileged, and listen, whatever we're talking about is under inherently privileged. Are people that do? I'm sorry. Are people going to fight against each other physically? Probably not, because none of us want that on our resumes.
Well,
do we want to? Are there going to be violent clashes? I'm guessing not, because believe me, people are way too nice here at USC to do that. Are people going to bring out tiki torches? Are people going to bring out guns or Molotov? No, they're not. So, in a sense, we have the solution nearby.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's also about, how do we use our privilege not looking at it as a sort of, unfair privilege, but as a gift, because we have worked really, really hard to, attend this institution. So how can we give back to the community? And I think that,
Well, no, wait, what community though? Again, I think what community? Here's the thing, let's not kid ourselves. USC is not organic to the South Los Angeles community. It's not even organic to anything. It's
it's a self-isolated entity.
And if it is, let's solve our problem within the entity. That's my problem. They're trying to reconnect to a more kind of somehow primal sense of identity,
right?
Which I have a problem with. We're USC students. Are we self-righteous, coddled, spoiled brats?
Some people maybe, but that's not. Our
Yes, we
problem
are.
as a-
Yes, we are. I think we are. I think
we
we all
do
are.
have some, to some extent we are influenced by that culture, but that doesn't mean
No.
that is the sole thing that defines us.
No, of course, no, but that's the reality of it. I mean, sure, we could say that we are more emotionally mature, more considerate. Yeah.
We have to acknowledge that,
Yeah,
obviously.
Yes, but that doesn't change the fact that we're paying a ridiculous. All of us. If you are, a spoiled, rich, libertarian, white, fat guy, or if you're quote unquote woke,
Or like a full merit scholar.
sure,
That doesn't apply, but
are we, in relative terms, in a position of privilege? Yes.
Yes,
Are
we
we
are.
isolated? Yes, we are.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a good thing
Yeah,
because
exactly.
rather than being consumed by the heated political rhetoric of this country as a nation, not that that is a bad thing because we do have to address that, but I think that unless we can self-regulate ourselves within the community, actually represent the ideals of USC as an institution.
What
to
is the
go be-
ideals of USC as an institution, though?
Right, in terms of, I should not be forgetting this as a student, but in terms of ambition, ideological openness, radical open-mindedness, I
Let's
think
not kid
that's
ourselves, shall we? USC is a bunch of self-privileged kids who want to get a good college degree, get a good job in PR in about 4 years.
right. Well, that's
I mean,
very enlightening.
no, when I
It's
say
true.
that, I'm not saying this in. I mean, sure, I could be cynical, but that's not a bad thing. Like what I'm saying is, we have a very tangible reality. Instead of isolating ourselves into abstract terms of we're the liberal students or the conservative students, let's acknowledge that sure, we have a singular identity, which is we're USC students, and
we have the resources to become greater than our ideological, emotional, whatever you want to call
exactly.
it, to transcend our own flaws, and that's what we can do to represent USC.
Right,
That's
exactly.
what you're trying to say.
Well, not represent USC.
Well,
Again, that's again externalizing things.
again,
But-
yeah, it is all one system at the end of the day.
Exactly.
We can't separate ourselves from the larger community of the U.S. and whatnot. But
Well-
you can't gloss over the fact that we are, as an institution, we are trying to accomplish our own sense of
Right, in a
purpose,
sense,
our
I mean,
own mission.
To make, I think, here's the thing, I think when I say that when USC is an isolated body, I almost mean in the sense that we're a theocracy. I think so, because
Haven't thought of it that way, yeah.
exactly, I mean, we are an ideologically charged body,
True.
isolated financially, geographically, socially from the rest of the community in a very we have a set of ideals, whether that's written in the dean's letter or if it's a shared underlying sentiment.
Right.
It's
How's
there.
it theological though?
No, I mean just I'm comparing to theology. I mean,
Okay. Yeah. In terms of hierarchically.
no. I'm just saying do we share? I mean, theology in a sense. I mean, a theocracy. I think is not just that we have the state of. It's a governing body, a self-governing body, not organized by socio-economic terms, but in a religious an ideological term.
Yeah, I think that, in this context, you can't really separate. Religion is a form of ideology. The way they come together as a community.
Are we though? Because I think we kind of give religion a theological assumption.
I don't think it even matters because that's the thing. Like whether you're in a theological institution or whatnot, ideology still works in the same way. Again, to create the sense of boundary, to create a sort of echo chamber. Again, you have to. Whenever you have an ideology, one of the things we learned in our communication and culture class is that Louis Althusser mentioned this concept of interpolation, right? And I'm pretty sure, we've heard of it in our class as well. We are interpolated as subjects of ideology through our social interactions, and that creates the division. And the ironic thing is that if we try to escape that through antagonizing those that are still under the ideology, we from our sense of pride and ego, we like to say that, oh, you guys are simpletons, we're awake, we're higher consciousness. there's a lot of that in the New Age community. So, and that's a whole nother story. But it's kind of like, because we've been so conditioned to act as subjects of ideology, to think in terms of dominance hierarchies where one group has to always overtake the other. Even if we try to escape our own ideology, we are still boxed within this framework as subjects of ideology that have to, undermine the sovereignty, the emotional and, outward self-expression of other groups.
Right, and again, to tie back to Ben Shapiro, because I feel sometimes we
kind of go off into a
exactly
philosophical tangent. Yeah.
In a sense, my solution to Ben Shapiro in a spiritual angle is to say, don't just assume that the university, USC, is just a battleground.
Right.
But in a sense, assume that it's your home. Would you fight in your home? Not necessarily. I mean, would you discuss? Would you debate? Of course you would. And that's why there is a kind of a counter protest to Ben Shapiro coming, not because they're against Ben Shapiro, not because they're against Ben Shapiro. Sure, they could be against Ben Shapiro, but their point is, we should allow Ben Shapiro to be here.
Right.
Not because we agree with what he's saying. It's because we are accepting Ben Shapiro here as a community.
Yeah, and it's like taking the higher moral ground.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think that's the answer to that, I think.
Yeah, when you look at that dynamic, it's interesting because again, I just want to relate it back to that concept of self and no self. It's the Secular Student Fellowship. What he was talking about is they're trying to organize a counter protest, to the student body that wanted to set off alarms and, phones ringing and whatnot to disrupt the Ben Shapiro event. But I think that they can be most successful because, again, they are a secular organization if they actually dig into the cause, to the emotional, psychological root of human conflict and actually try to embody their moral values.
Right.
By it's not even self versus no self in that case. It's how do we represent our best self? How do we represent the best of humanity? What we can be if we are, if we choose to see each other as people who are all searching for the truth. And it doesn't even have to, going back to Ben Shapiro, he doesn't even have to see us as home, because let's face it, if you're going to be realistic, nobody's going to do that. Even if we put that expectation on ourselves, if we go into a
no, of course he's only coming because we're charging him a certain amount of money.
Yeah, another community, we're not going to do that. But it's all about, okay, we are all in this together. We are all searching for truth. How do we use our highest emotions to actually, come to a truth that does not, place one identity group above another? How do we embody our best self?
I think that's, to put it in simple terms, I think, is sure we could fight, but we shouldn't fight only because we believe that each other's right. And, when we ask each other questions, it's not that I think you're right and I think you're wrong. I think we should be just asking simply why. Why do you support? And not just because don't answer the why question with because of something else. Because, okay, I believe that because, honestly, why do you support him? I think that's the answer we should be asking. Instead of just constantly fighting over each other to assume that each other's right, we should be asking, okay, why do I think that's right?
Right. And it's all about, not just, who are we fighting against? I think if we recontextualize that question, not who are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for within ourselves so that we can express the transcendent ideal? Because, concepts such as God or rationality, whatever our highest value within our hierarchy of values, as Jordan Peterson would call it, because he's another relevant speaker, how do we not misuse the goals that we set for ourselves to actually embody our highest human emotions and to actually form a sense of cohesiveness? It is fighting for our best self together, not fighting amongst ourselves.
Right. I think that's a good. I've realized for the past 20 minutes we've been agreeing with each other. So I think we should conclude our first episode with
echo chamber. Before we do that, I'd just like to include a quote from Matthew Arnold, one of the.
I think that could be our that could be our concluding quote. Might as well.
Sure. Let me find this for a second.
That's all right.
Okay. So before we go to Arnold, I think I'd like to bring in a quote from Antonio Gramsci as well. It says, "The strength of religions," this is highly contested obviously, "the strength of religions, and of the Catholic Church in particular, lies in the fact that they feel very strongly the need for doctrinal unity of the whole mass to ensure that the highest intellectual stratum does not get separated from the lower." And I think that is the issue of, okay, by rebelling against ideology, are you still under the influence of being subjected as a subject of ideology that, sees the world in terms of hierarchy and conflict, and not in terms of addressing our emotional, I don't want to say flaws, but our emotional setbacks? And Matthew Arnold, to summarize his perspective, he says, "But by our best self, we are united, impersonal, at harmony. We are in no peril from giving authority to this. By this, he means the transcendent ideal. He calls it the state. But," he says, "because it is the truest friend all of us can have. And when anarchy is a danger to us, to this authority we may turn with sure trust." This authority being our highest emotions, our highest ideals that we set for ourselves as a collective society. This is the very self which culture, or the study of perfection, seeks to develop in us, at the expense of our old, untransformed self, taking pleasure in only doing things what it likes or is used to do.
Alright, so that's our end of our first episode. Thank you so much for listening. I've been Joshua Chang.
And I'm Austin Patrick.